doing the very thing that the law forbid, and that was exploiting people and making money off of them. The law forbids that. They cannot make money off the exploitation of the poor.
Mm-hmm.
And so when Yahushua left and the apostles were upholding the law as the way the Torah taught it, as the way Moses taught it, Paul infiltrated Christianity to make sure that the Christians were not going to follow this law because, you know, they're all in the Masonic Brotherhood at the time. Paul's father was a Roman government official. Paul was a rich Pharisee. He was of the elite Jews, the rich, what we call the rich elite. They didn't want the status quo changed. So he couldn't afford to have a whole new movement of people reinstituting the Torah of Moses when they had already bamboozled them into following the lies of the Talmud that they had taken over the Jewish population with. Mm-hmm. And so his whole thing was to infiltrate Christianity, and he taught a very anti-law message. It was totally against the Mosaic law, and all he did was he would build up churches and make pronouncements of doctrines they were to follow as in opposite to what the Lord and the apostles were doing. The Lord and the apostles, when, you know, after the Lord rose from the dead and went to heaven, the apostles never established churches. That was Paul. Paul established churches. Paul tied a license to sin mentality and came out with this law of grace. And there's no law of grace. The Lord never taught a thing about a law of grace, neither did the other 12 apostles. It was all about Paul to try to replace the commandment that we were to follow the laws of Moses.
Mm-hmm. So if somebody believed the writings of Paul, would that by necessity send them to hell?
Well, if they're following if they're following the laws of Paul, which most of them are because they're meeting on Sundays, and it was Paul who said, "Don't let anybody question you on what day you celebrate the Sabbath." That's ridiculous. You know, this is the way Paul teaches. When the Lord blatantly said, "Honor the seventh day and keep my Sabbath day holy," mm-hmm. and then Paul comes along and says, "Don't let men question you when you celebrate the Sabbath." Mm. He's in direct contradiction to what the Lord teaches, and he does it on every single book that he says. Before Jesus rose from the dead, before he left, he warned to beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. Who was a Pharisee? Paul. He warned of the one who would come in his own name. Mm-hmm. He said, you know, I came in my Father's name, and you won't accept me, but you will accept the one who comes in his own name. In about 10 different books that Paul writes, he starts them out, I, Paul. He comes in his own name. Mm-hmm. And he even calls himself an apostle. There's not one of the other apostles ever referred to Paul as an apostle.
Really?
And they use this vague reference in the book of Peter where Peter calls him brother because he was a kinsman brother. Paul was from the tribe of Benjamin. And so they say, well, he's calling him brother, so that means they agreed with him. Hmm. You know, and they never agreed with him. In fact, what they found in the Dead Sea Scrolls was, they call it the Damascus document. It was Paul's official excommunication from the church. He was excommunicated.
But that could be a good thing, though, right?
Well, you won't find that in the KJV. All the churches are based on Pauline doctrines from a man that James and Peter had excommunicated from the church as a heretic.
Okay.
And then he dominates Christianity and the teachings in the churches today.
Hmm. Couldn't we say, though, regardless of people's view of Paul and or their inclusive research, that Christianity in general, and I know there's some definitely the Masonic order, but didn't Christianity sort of bring order to a world of chaos, irregardless of whether they ended up, you know, with the Crusades and people were killed, obviously, but in the end, wouldn't that sort of order be better than what the world had?
Well, all they did was take Paul's political message, because Paul came with a political ideology to make the church subservient to government, and that's why they liked him. He was their man. He put the church under the control of the government. He's telling the early churches of that day, browbeating them into believing that they have to follow all the dictates of the government. And you'll find, there was a thing on the internet last year about what the pastors were revealing, that they had been approached by FEMA and Homeland Security stating that when America goes into martial law and property seizure starts and forced relocation begins, you are to preach Romans 13 from your pulpit. Hmm. And this is Homeland Security and FEMA telling our pastors that they have to teach Romans 13 because Romans 13 admonishes the people to obey the government. And so all that happened was they took religion and politicized it, put it underneath government control.
Mm-hmm. Back and be under the old covenant?
Well, it was never done away with. Some of the things were fulfilled. The sacrificial aspects were fulfilled because Yahushua was the perfect sacrifice. We no longer have to do that. But if we were living under the law, Daniel, you wouldn't be in debt. You wouldn't be bogged down by debt. There would be no interest because interest was forbidden by the law.
I'm with
The
you on
law
that.
is not burdensome. People get this distorted view of what it would like to live under the law, but if they were, they'd have liberty and freedom. There would be no interest. There would be no debt. Every 7 years, your debts are forgiven. The Jews of Jesus' day were oppressing the people through interest, which was forbidden by the law. You can't make money off of other people. It's forbidden by the law. If you want to make money, you get an honest job, an honest trade to make money, not off the suffering and off the back of the poor people.
Now, it seems to me, I read Paul said, I could charge you for the gospel, but I'm not going to.
Well, I don't know if I've read that, but Paul said he taught another gospel, and he admonishes his followers, follow me as I follow the Lord. Well, why should we follow Paul? Follow the Lord yourself. Jesus, Yahushua said, I am the door. Not knock on Paul to get to me.
Yeah. Well, what about the book of Acts? Should we disregard that?
The book of Acts, well, that's the funniest book there is, so I disregard it.
Whoa.
If you really want to know how messed up Paul is, read the book of Acts.
Yikes.
Because in the first chapter, Peter talks about the qualifications to be an apostle. Paul doesn't qualify. And it also, it's where Paul reveals his Damascus Road revelation. He tells it differently every time he spoke it. And, the Lord said, by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses shall all things be established. So where are Paul's witnesses that he's an apostle, that he had this Damascus Road revelation? Not one soldier was ever found to confirm his story. Yahushua said, if I bear witness of myself, my witness is not true. Paul had no witnesses, period.
Wow. Well, that's definitely, I'm sure there are definitely some things you're saying there that you could see. As you see, somebody could literally see how you could come to some of those conclusions. And of course, obviously, there's a lot of people who have other conclusions. But it's weird because and I know that you're happy with your conclusions about Paul and his effect and who he was, and others are very happy with theirs. Of course, then what you have, of course, is isolated camps. And you're going to be the devil, and then from your point of view, other people are in apostasy. So, how do you bring those two camps together, Sherry?
Well, you just can't. You either believe you can see it or you can't. I've read the Bible 100 times, cover to cover, front to back. Most of the people that would vehemently deny Paul have never read the Bible. Otherwise, they would know that there's 2 different gospels being preached: one that the Lord and the 12 apostles taught, and one that Paul teaches. And the funny thing is about the churches today is that they will proclaim that Jesus changed his mind when they went to heaven. Yahushua changed his mind and sent Paul because the other apostles just weren't getting this whole thing about grace. So he had to stand up Paul to teach the churches this new doctrine of grace. There is no such thing as a doctrine of grace. It was invented by Paul so that they would no longer follow the law that the Lord commanded them to follow.
And where exactly did Yeshua order people to follow the law?
Oh, I'll give you 100 scriptures. The whole time he was talking about following the 10 Commandments, that he came to fulfill the law, not destroy the law. The law will not be fulfilled until heaven and earth pass away. If we're following it now and we're following it during the millennium, where does the church get this age of grace where we no longer have to follow it? We get a vacation until the millennium starts, because they know we're following it during the millennium.
Yeah.
They can't argue that one. So how can they say that for 2,000 years we're on a vacation of grace? We don't have to be under the law.
Well, it seems to me it's one of those sort of things that it's like the rapture. You've got at least 5 different camps on that one. I'm just trying to see how we can bring people together a little bit. But I understand what you're saying. I understand exactly what you're saying about that there seems to be diametrically opposed points of view. And I know people that are listening to you may want to turn off, but it's just maybe people need to listen just a little bit, and then that should make us all more astute, more cognizant of what we are reading and what we have been led to believe. And I think that's a good point.
Why do you believe what you believe? That's the most basic thing, because when you question, why do you believe what you believe? That's when you can start finding what the truth is. The church doesn't want you questioning what you believe. They want you to accept anything you're told at face value.
I think
if you dare question it, you're not a Christian.
Well, I definitely think all camps can agree with that. But and I also say that I would say by and large those that are on the opposing viewpoint of who and what Paul was and did are probably more inclined to be in a church, because they're not going to be allowed to have a question at all about some of what you pointed out, or obvious contradictions, and which they should be pointed out. And how can somebody that's in a church even ask somebody in that church without them being called an apostate? Because they say, well, you don't need to even think about it because our church fathers 800 years ago decided this was the truth, and so we've got that settled. Now let's go have a bean supper. You can't really
when I
get
was
there.
14 years old.